Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jake Doman. I'm with Axion. Very excited to introduce our first guest of the day, Donna Brighton with Brighton Leadership. And Brighton Leadership and the connection to Axion is through the Executives Club of Chicago. They've been great partners of ours. They've been great partners to our clients. They've worked with me personally for a very long time. What they do best is they're the best at optimizing leadership for organizations, specifically in the middle market. So we're gonna have a brief little conversation. I'm very excited. I don't want to steal Donna's thunder. I'm gonna let her introduce herself and the company, and then we're gonna get into the topics.
Fabulous. Thanks, Jake. So, as you said, I'm Donna Brighton, and our goal is to help each and every one of you as leaders become your best self, bring your best self to work, and then in the organization that you operate in, have it be at the highest level of performance. And we do that in a variety of ways, which we can talk about at another time. But absolutely, as a result of working with us, everyone walks away with better levels of performance.
Fabulous, Donna. I think I don't like to talk about everything that's going on in the economy a lot, but it's very pertinent as we talk about the topic today of change. There's a lot of different things happening in the economy. There's a lot of different things happening in the Midwest and Chicago business. We see change happening everywhere. And for you, what stands in the way of leading successful change? And what are a couple pieces of advice that you would give organizations to manage the rate at which companies move through that change?
Mm, Excellent question, Jake. So, the first thing I'd like everybody to take away is there's actually a difference between change and transition. And we conflate that a lot. And here's what I mean by that: change is the external situation, it's the things happening around us that we may or may not have control of. And as a leader, many leaders decide to make change. So, they're actually being intentional about it. But obviously, the pandemic is a change that none of us decided that we wanted. We just needed to respond to it. So, change is the external things that are going on. And the difference, the transition piece, is the internal part. That's where there's a challenge in terms of the pace of change. So, you asked about the roadblocks, and I'll share three of them with you. The first has to do with capacity. So, as you talk about the pace of change, there's more and more changes externally as well as internally within the organization. Now, imagine that each person in your organization and within yourself as a leader, you have a sponge. Okay, so just imagine this sponge, and that sponge has the ability to absorb a certain amount of change, right? And then transition and process and adopt, get the buy in, all those things we talk about when it comes to change. Well, you don't have a personal change and a professional change, sponge, excuse me. There's not two different sponges. You have a single sponge that absorbs everything that's going on, right? Everything that happens in the world, in your organization, and in your personal life. And for those who had children that they were trying to manage at home at the same time that they're trying to do their work, right? All of these things are taking up sponge space. And when I bring that up to you, the reason that matters is because that is the capacity that people have to adapt to change. So one of the reasons that leaders are challenged to make more change in their organizations is their teams, their people are oversaturated. They have more change going on externally and they can't do the internal transition to keep up. So the opportunity is either squeeze out the sponge or grow the sponge. And that comes from a leader being clear and understanding what are all the changes happening and then reprioritizing them. So that's kind of the squeezing process. And then growing comes from resilience practices. And that's a whole other conversation.
Hmm.
So capacity is one of the things that gets in the way of successful change. Another item that gets in the way and prevents successful change is culture. And that's something that a lot of leaders have been thinking about. And let me give you a really simple definition. Culture is nothing more than the way we do things around here. So when you're in a meeting, does everybody bring their best ideas, or is everybody quiet and waiting for the boss to share their ideas so that they can agree with them, right? Like whatever those patterns of behavior are, that's the culture. And what happens when you're trying to make change as a leader? We've worked with organizations who are implementing a new strategy. And the reality was that new strategy, while it was absolutely going to drive success for the business, there were elements in their culture that were going to prevent that from being successful because there were beliefs and behaviors that were in the context of that culture that were just going to get in the way. So it's really essential when you're making change, especially significant change, to understand what's happening in your culture so that you know where that culture will help or hinder your change. So we've got capacity, culture, and then the last element of successful change and what can get in the way of successful change is leadership. And believe it or not, the number one reason for success or failure in any change has to do with leadership. And it's interesting, right? Because we can have the best plan, the change can be 100% the change that needs to happen. But when the leader is not participating, supporting, and involved in the change, it's not going to be as successful as it needs to be. So, Jake, those are just a couple of things that stand in the way of successful change: capacity, culture, and commitment from leadership.
I love the way that you talk about capacity like a sponge, and both dividing it professionally and personally, because you're right.
Mhm.
The world that we live in today, a lot of times those two spaces blend. It very, very interesting perspective: capacity, culture, and leadership. I love the three. We're talking a lot. The main focus here is the leaders.
Yes.
How would you explain to leaders different ways to embrace the change that's happening?
Yeah, great. So the opportunity is to either hide, right? Like, oh my goodness, there's so much change. But my experience, and this is how I differentiate the people I work with, true leaders, as I've observed, love change, right? They almost embrace more change than their organization can handle. So the opportunity for the leaders is to recognize that change creates disruption, and that disruption serves to power new ways of thinking, growth, and so on. And the reality is that as a leader in the past, you can learn enough about what's going on so that you alone knew what needed to happen. In today's world where there's so much change going on, one of the most important skills that a leader can grow, develop, and adopt is to increase their question asking. Now, that might be a really unique, like
Yeah.
really asking questions, but here's why. Because if you assume you know everything and you are just operating and making decisions based on that knowledge, you're probably missing out. So, the best leaders, the most equipped leaders in this century are the ones who are asking questions more than telling. And what that does is it starts bringing in the perspective of everybody in the organization. And it enables that leader to have a broader perspective because it's your perspective plus the set of facts that are occurring that equal your reality. So if you have a really narrow perspective because you're only bringing your point of view to the situation and you're examining the facts from that narrow perspective, your reality is not going to be very broad and you may not make the best decision possible. So, in this world where there's so much change going on, one of the tips I have for leaders is really pay attention to the amount of question asking you do versus the amount of telling.
Interesting. It's very, in my opinion, it's very easy to have a clear vision in your own head, right?
Yes.
I know where we want to go. I know how we can get there. But if you don't have everybody on the ship rowing in the same direction, it's
Mhm.
hard. And to your
Yes.
point, I think asking effective questions is a form of great communication
Absolutely.
and
And
building that person. Sure.
yes. And for a lot of leaders, it's interesting because they say, like, why don't people just do what I tell them to do? And I say, well, are you a parent? And if they are, I say, well, tell me how well that works for your kids. When you just tell them, they always automatically do what you tell them to do. It doesn't happen. So just like it doesn't work with your kids, it doesn't work in the office.
I
And,
like it.
we were talking about change. And as a leader, when you want to create change, successful change in your organization, just telling people never works. So here's the secret. You ready? The only way to create sustainable, lasting change is when the person hearing about this change believes it's in their own best interest. So think about that, right? Like we can tell them you have to do this or else you're going to lose your job. Well, they think it's in my best interest to do this, right? But in the long term, does that fear tactic really work? Probably not.
Right.
So that's the opportunity for leaders is figuring out how to communicate the change in such a way that people understand why the current state is not sustainable, what is that exactly is going to happen with that change, how it's going to benefit them and how it's going to impact them, right? Because that's always what people want to know. What is going to happen to me?
Definitely.
And why do I want to buy into this change?
Absolutely. Phenomenal. This has been, truly the best couple of minutes I've had in a very long time. Very insightful. Donna, I appreciate your time. A couple quick takeaways. Um, Three things that stand in a leader's way for successful change: capacity, culture, and then, of course, the effective leadership.
Mhm.
And then I really like, and I'm going to bring it into my own terms, communicating effectively by asking questions
Yes.
and getting everybody together on the same page and bringing that perspective. Very interesting. Donna, I want to thank you. I want to thank Brighton Leadership. Thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to our future engagements together.
Fabulous. Thanks, Jake. And I'd love to make the offer to your audience for anyone who's interested and would find it valuable. We created something completely free called the Change Leader Toolkit. And it's downloadable and it enables you to track all the changes. So we talked about capacity. Most leaders are shocked when they actually take an inventory of all their changes. It enables you to identify what success looks like for each of those changes and helps you as a leader remember to take an activity or do something every day that leads to the success of all of those changes so that you can practice better change leadership. So we'd love to offer that to the audience, Jake.
Absolutely. We use it internally. I've used it with our teams before. It's a fabulous tool. Thank you so much again, Donna. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jake.